Progesterone has its whole other supportive structure, like improving GABA, which is anti-anxiety, helping with sleep. Progesterone to me is really important. Testosterone I would throw into that mix. It wasn't part of the conversation today because we don't have as many studies on women, although it helps with sexual dysfunction, brain, mood, and also bone and muscle. The other thing is we also have other symptoms to menopause that are not just hot flashes, night sweats, and vaginal dryness. It can be heart palpitations, cardiovascular memory issues, insomnia, mood, anxiety, depression, joint pain, frozen shoulder, GERD-like symptoms, fatigue. All of those are also concerning. And we now have good data coming out of Dr. Wright's office that shows us that menopause is absolutely a driver of joint pain and other musculoskeletal concerns. Are you navigating the choppy waters of perimenopause? You're not alone, and I've got something that might be your lifeline. Let me introduce my new product, Estro Balance Mastery. This isn't just another supplement, it is a perimenopausal powerhouse. Estro Balance Mastery is a medical-grade formula designed by me to support you through the transitional phase. Let's break down these powerful ingredients and how they work for perimenopause. DIM and chrysin are your dynamic duo for managing erratic estrogen levels that cause hot flashes and night sweats and mood swings. If you're feeling foggy, the flaxseed extract is rich in lignans that support cognitive function and help clear that perimenopausal brain fog. And ladies, if those night sweats are killing your sleep, the green tea extract and broccoli sprout compounds work together to help regulate body temperature. But that's not all. Milk thistle supports your liver, which is crucial for hormone metabolism during this time. The best part is it's 2 capsules a day, and you're giving your body the support it needs to navigate perimenopause with grace. It's made in an FDA USA inspected facility, and you're getting quality ingredients. All you've got to do is head over to metabolicblueprint.com/pod10, and that's metabolicblueprint.com/pod10 to get 10% off your first bottle. That's right, it's 10% off just to get started on your journey to a smoother perimenopause. Welcome back to Menopause Mastery. So today I want to do a year in review. I really want to walk through all of the studies, or at least not all of the studies, but the major studies that have come out in the last few years that really start to answer the question about the safety of hormones, particularly the different age groups and different body conditions. And specifically, some of the information that you guys may not have heard, because for whatever reason, and if you listen to my podcast, I have some particular opinions about why we don't have as much information about the safety of hormone replacement for women. And particularly when research comes out that shows that it's safe, it just doesn't seem to get the fanfare that many other news outlets use and pick up when they like to do sensational, topics that often are poorly studied and or poorly controlled. And so today I want to help dispel those myths. I want to help you understand what the recent research shows, particularly around hormone replacement, in some key areas in women's health. So I'm going to give you kind of a summary of what some of those advancements and studies really said. So I'm going to start first with kind of the emerging understanding of hormone replacement therapy, where we've been historically. And I will touch on the Women's Health Initiative because I think we have to, even though I talk about it every week. But I feel like I have to almost always put everything in that context. So to just give context to everybody, I went and spoke this weekend at the most fabulous women's event called GoBundance Women. And, I had all these lovely women in the audience, about 70, 75 women. And I was still surprised by how many had pre-existing beliefs around hormones and hormones replacement. For instance, estrogen and hormones give you cancer, that it's unsafe and it causes strokes, and that, hormones were always dangerous and that it was appropriate to take them off the market, ignoring the fact that they had been on the market for a very long time. So let's talk first. Let me give a little bit of context in history, and then we'll go into what the recent studies have said over the last year or two so you can really understand it as you make your own decisions. So first and foremost, hormone replacement therapy, particularly estrogen replacement therapy, in the form of conjugated equine estrogen, which comes from horse mare urine. It contains 13 different estrogens, and it was under the brand name Premarin for the longest time. It is, of course, now a generic under conjugated equine estrogen. Now, that was standard of care all the way from the 50s and 60s onward until 2002. And quite honestly, that was one of the most prescribed drugs on the planet. And depending on the country you looked at, as far as standard of care, the majority of women, anywhere between 40 and 80% of women, depending on the country you looked at, were given hormone replacement as a treatment for the menopause transition up until 2002. And that was when the Women Health Study was initially released to the media before peer review, and it had significant bias. And so anybody that hasn't heard me before, this was the largest women's health study that was going to analyze one particular area, and that was, does hormone replacement reduce the risk of stroke and heart attack? Specifically, that's all it was designed. So that's important point number one. You got to know that when you create a study, the only really valid data you have is what were you studying, right? That's the closest you're going to get. And then bias can come in there and mess it up. So that was the original study. So when they designed the study, in order to make it last only a few years, like 7 to 10 years, 15 years, they specifically left out healthy women. So they removed any healthy women from the population of the potential candidates. And so the women that were left in the study, average age was 63, so they were considerably outside of the first window of menopause, since the average age in the United States is 51. Number two, these women already had pre-existing cardiovascular and metabolic disease, hypertension, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, high triglycerides, metabolic syndrome, obesity. Many were smokers. So they excluded healthy women. So the first thing you need to know about studies, if they leave out healthy people, you cannot generalize the results of the study to healthy people because you never looked at them. And from a study design standpoint, I understand why they did that, because they wanted to figure out if somebody was going to die. So they needed people that had a high potential to die. The other thing they did is they intentionally left out women who were symptomatic with menopausal symptoms. Often some women, not all, but some women get over their symptoms 10 to 15 years later. And so they don't have the hot flashes and night sweats, which are the hallmarks of basically the menopause transition in the medical world. So the other thing is the creators of the study really had this previous bias that they were carrying into the study, and they wanted to get rid of, and I quote, the runaway train of hormone replacement for women. Despite the fact that this was considered, something that all men deserve if their testosterone is low, they felt like women did not need hormone replacement, even though it had been done for decades. And so that was the bias. And essentially, they stopped the study because one arm of the study that was taking Prem-Pro, which was the Premarin conjugated equine estrogen, and a synthetic progestin that is known to have clotting risk, in the women that were taking that, a small percentage, but it was statistically significant, showed increased risk for stroke risk. So they stopped the study. And then they started mining for data. So as a researcher, I can tell you that anytime you start digging in old data to extrapolate new answers, you have to take that with some major caution, because those are confounding variables and other variables that you were not controlling for. So if I go looking in this same population database to figure out, did they have gallbladder issues or did they have, memory issues, right? They didn't test for that, but just use it as an example. If I go looking for that in that data, but they didn't control for it, you've got a lot of other confounding things, other issues that may change the outcome of the study because it wasn't designed to do so. But that's a huge part of research today. People go mining for data because it's expensive. And if you got pre-existing data, sort of extrapolate those answers. And I've used that exact same method to study things, but I control for it, right? So they went and mined for other data. And so they started putting out information about other statistics. The other major statistic that they sent to the media and they allowed to get extrapolated out across the planet was erroneous data. In all women, if you are menopausal and after, you have a 4 in 1,000 chance to have breast cancer. Period. End of sentence. Doesn't matter what you do, right? 4 women out of 1,000 are estimated to have cancer. In this particular group, when they did the statistical analysis, that number went to 5 in 1,000. So that is not statistically significant. It shouldn't have even been mentioned because it was complete bullshit. But what they did instead is they said, oh my God, it was a 25% increase in breast cancer risk. A 4 to a 5 is a 25% increase, but it is not relevant when you are looking at 1,000 people. It is if you're looking at 10, but it's not when you're looking at 1,000. And that's where the wives' tale, the dogma, the lie that estrogen causes cancer, particularly breast cancer, started. Even in the Women's Health Initiative data, in the very first issue of that study, it showed that the arm that was taking the conjugated equine estrogen alone actually had a 23% decreased risk of breast cancer. Please listen to that. Women who were on estrogen therapy had a reduced risk of breast cancer. So the boomers should be mad because they have been robbed over the last 20 years of hormone replacement because of erroneous study design and flat out lies. Now, in the past several years, we've had a lot of emerging research that really shows bioidentical hormone replacement, especially for women in the menopause transition and beyond, is safe and effective. And to be honest, all the studies that pretty much were done prior to the Women's Health Initiative also showed that to be true. So let's start with one of the biggest. I've talked about this one before, but I want to make sure that we get this underway because this is still propagated out to women by physicians and clinicians who don't actually read research, who don't actually go in and read the study. So one of the things I implore you to do, if you're nerdy like me, and most of my listeners are, and you want to understand things, you want to try and get a hold of the entire study, not just the abstract, that little paragraph, because the abstract, number one, is only a couple hundred words. It doesn't give you the full data. And often that gets misconstrued and massaged to fit the tenor and amusement of this journal it's getting published in, right? So it doesn't always reflect the data inside. And especially if there are charts and tables and what they call supplemental data that might give you more information, that's often where the real gems are. That's where you can start looking at like age group stratification, where it's like, okay, let's say it was a larger group, but what did it mean to the 40 to 50-year-olds? What did it mean to the 55 to 65 or 65 to 75? That's where that data is going to be buried, and they often don't give you the full effect when they're writing it up. So just think about it that way. If you can get a hold of the entire study, you want to do that. So let's start with one of the major studies that came out this year, and to me, this is probably one of the most groundbreaking, important analysis that have been done in decades. So this is a groundbreaking analysis of 10 million senior women on Medicare. So first thing is all the women in this study were at least 65 or older. And they were looking at 3 arms of this study. So it was women on HRT, women who only did hormone replacement therapy for a few months or a few years just to get rid of their hot flashes, and then women who did nothing. In the arm of the study that had women taking hormones, they were able to capture 2 different groups. The group that took oral estrogen and probably either oral or vaginal progestin, and women who took estrogen and oral progesterone. This is for the first time that we were able to really get good data between those 2 groups. They often get muddled together and it's hard to extrapolate the value of one over the other. And again, this is a 10 million woman study. And it really showed that hormones, when tailored to women, given topically for estrogen, orally for progesterone, not progestins, it reduced all-cause mortality, including cardiovascular and cancer risk. And so let's talk about this one particularly just to give you a little idea and a little bit of understanding. So first off, when they looked at the overall mortality risk, so mortality is a fancy way of saying, are you going to die, right? So the estradiol monotherapy, so they looked at women on estradiol alone, they showed a 21% reduced risk for all-cause mortality, heart attack, stroke, bone cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer, osteoporosis, all of that reduced risk, 21%. When we looked at combination therapies of topical estradiol and progesterone, we saw that there was variable reduced risk in all-cause mortality also. It's just alone in monotherapy in women who've had their uterus removed, they showed a reduced risk across the board that was at 21% or better. And then the combination therapy was anywhere between like 0.3% up to 34%. So hormone replacement therapy in this large 10 million sample study showed that it was protective. Certain hormone replacement therapy showed either a neutral or reduced risk, particularly for cardiovascular disease and all cancers. And then when we look at the overall risk to breast cancer, the synthetic progestins seem to have the greatest effect. And if you look at stroke and heart attack risk, synthetic progestins seem to have the greatest effect. And the blood clotting risk and the heart attack and stroke risk, because of that, is basically only associated with the intake of oral estrogens and oral progestins, not progesterone and not topical estradiol. So all the women that have been told that hormones are going to give them stroke and heart attack, that's inaccurate. All the women that were told it was going to give them breast cancer, that's inaccurate. All the women that were told bioidentical hormone replacement was unnecessary, that ended up with osteoporosis and osteopenia, suffered unnecessarily. And if they had just been given hormone replacement, they would have seen less, if not no, bone loss, because estrogen is the primary driver of bone rebuilding, right? So what's the take-home message of this particular study? So this one is tailored bioidentical hormone replacement therapy with estradiol and or Biest given topically, right? So it's a patch, a cream, a pellet, or an oil. We tend to, in our clinic and our telemedicine, we use topicals in the form of oils and or patches. Creams we'd use, but we find that these other preparations work better. When we look at progesterone, oral micronized progesterone in usually between 100, 150, 200 milligrams is standard dosing. That helps with sleep, helps relax. It also is protective to the uterus. And if you have a uterus, you must take progesterone if you're going to take estradiol, because estradiol's job is to bring blood supply to the uterus. So we want to make sure that we have that. And those have no increased risk, right? So topical estradiol and oral micronized progesterone is your best source. Stay away from birth control as your transition tool for menopause, and stay away from synthetic forms of progestins. And I would say today, also stay away from oral estrogen, because when you take estrogens orally, what happens is they get transported to the liver. The liver goes through its detoxification process, which I talked about on episode number 98. I talked about why estrogen detox is important. So when I take in oral estrogen, it goes through that detox process and produces all these byproducts that then get metabolized and utilized in the body. That's where that clotting risk comes from. So just take it topically and it bypasses that system completely. So that personalization is really important, right? So that's the first take home. 10 million women, that's a big study. That's a very valid study. And again, the other major thing that it also showed was when do you start and how long? So the other thing is we know from the studies that the earlier you start hormone replacement therapy in the transition of perimenopause to menopause and postmenopause, the better it is, right? The most benefit we get. However, these women that were on hormones were well over 65, longer than the window that was generally recommended after the Women's Health Initiative. So the reality is the women that got on hormones and stayed on it had that protection. So there's no reason to stop those hormones. There's no reason to take them away, because those hormones tell our body that we are young, virile, and valid, right? So this study helps kind of further explore that. So next, let's talk about the Women's Health Initiative, right? So the Women's Health Initiative, obviously, I talked about the initial release of it. And what's interesting is in 8 years, they did a follow-up, and it showed that all their assertions about breast cancer were incorrect. They did a 20-year follow-up. It also showed that the women that they had sort of pigeonholed that they were going to have risk did not have risk. And in 2024, they reevaluated their statistical analysis, which should have been done ever before they actually published. And the reality is all of the assertions the Women's Health Initiative made about the risks of hormone replacement are wrong. And if you actually read the data, don't read their recommendations, because again, we've got people who still have a bias saying that women shouldn't get hormone replacement. But if you actually read the data inside, you'll see that the risks aren't there. They really just aren't there. And so that re-release never got the fanfare that it should have, never got really talked about in a way that's meaningful. So here's the take-home message on the reassessment that came out of 2024. The initial concerns and risks that were propagated about breast cancer and cardiovascular disease and stroke were overstated by the 2002 study. In 2024, when it was reanalyzed, the problems were not there. The risks were not there. They also found and also said bioidentical hormone replacement therapy effectively manages hot flashes, cardiovascular disease risks, so it actually helps, doesn't cause, and osteoporosis risks. And they, in their own argument, said the benefit outweighs risk when treatment is personalized. Again, if you use a personalized bioidentical functional medicine approach, personalizing to the individual, the risks are gone. And they were gone even without it. But are you women getting that message from your physicians and clinicians? Probably not, unless you're working with somebody like my team or somebody in the functional medicine community. So today, here's a stat that blows my mind. 100% of women go through menopause. 87% is symptomatic for 7 to 8 years on average. Only 1.83% of women in the United States in menopause are receiving bioidentical hormone replacement treatment. 1.83%. So that means, 85-ish% of women who are symptomatic are not being treated appropriately, or we are drug stacking, antidepressants, sleep medications, pain management pills, all these other things to cover up the underlying root cause, which is the loss of hormones because your ovarian egg carton ran out of eggs, right? And we just happen to live longer. So the WHI, every assertion they made about heart attack risk and cardiovascular risk and breast cancer has been found to be inaccurate, and it is perfectly protective. All right. So let's talk about another major study. So one of the other major studies that came out, it was by Dr. Rhonda Wright, and it was the musculoskeletal syndrome of menopause, right? The musculoskeletal syndrome of menopause. So musculoskeletal disorders like osteoporosis, osteopenia, frozen shoulder, joint pain, arthritis was studied. And what they found was quite interesting. So essentially, most women have no idea that when they go through perimenopause and menopause, they start to experience things like frozen shoulder, hip and joint pain, back pain, knee pain. And they go to their doctors and their doctors say, hey, this is just, getting older. No, it's actually the loss of estrogen. And there's a couple reasons why.
Ladies, are you ready to take control of your menopause journey? Introducing Mastering the Pause, the ultimate ebook that empowers you with the knowledge and tools to navigate this transformative phase with confidence and grace. Packed with expert guidance on hormone replacement, essential lab tests, personalized diet and lifestyle strategies, this book is your secret weapon to combat menopause-related challenges. Discover how to maintain a healthy metabolism, ward off belly fat, and embrace this new chapter of your life. Download your copy now at guide.hormoneshelp.com. That's guide.hormoneshelp.com. And let's make this a smooth and informed menopause transition today.
So estrogen, number one, helps stimulate collagen production. So we lose 30% of our collagen just by going through menopause. So that means that your collagen that makes up your ligaments, tendons, joints, that make the cartilage, that buffer those things, all diminishes. It also reduces our mucus production and lubrication everywhere. As you very well know, the world becomes a Sahara down there, right? But the other joints, the sacs around the joints, contain lubrication to keep the joint lubricated, just like you would put lubrication on your brakes to help your brakes work properly. So when we go through menopause, that lubrication in every part of the body reduces. Add to that the loss of bone mass through the development of osteoporosis and osteopenia because estrogen is no longer there to stimulate bone growth, and also loss of muscle mass because of the loss of hormones will make everything worse because you lose muscle mass, then you lose bone mass. We have the risk of becoming what they call sarcopenic, which is basically too little muscle mass on a frame. So you could be thin and sarcopenic, right? So you could be what we call a thin fat. You may be smaller in size, but your muscle mass is too low for your size. Or you can also be overweight and sarcopenic, which means you've got a lot of body fat, but not a lot of muscle, right? So that is one of your biggest risks for all-cause mortality. So loss of muscle mass and frailty kills us. And it is the one thing, the more muscle mass you have, the better your longevity, right? So when we look at the musculoskeletal syndrome of menopause, we see all of those things at play: loss of muscle mass, loss of bone, loss of lubrication, loss of collagen production, increasing in inflammation, which also causes arthritic conditions. And it is 100% directly related to the loss of our hormones. And women experience this at different rates than men because of that. So what did hormone replacement therapy actually show? Bioidentical hormone replacement therapy should be first-line therapy for the risk for osteoporosis and osteopenia. And absolutely, in the research, just replacing bioidentical hormones in a woman with osteoporosis will improve bone mineral density by 7%. If you add weight training, especially with some substantial weight, that has been shown in studies to improve it by another 3% at least. That is a 10% increase in bone mass without having to do bone drugs that have a lot of side effects that also don't perform as well. The other thing is hormone replacement therapy gives you strong bones that can take tensile strength. They're strong. They're not just dense. The drugs create dense bones, but they're not strong. The fracture risk in many cases are equal between the drugs and no drugs, right? Or at least close. And I like to think of it as, your DEXA scan, your bone density scan, looks through the bone. And all it can tell is what the surface level density is. There's other devices like the Reams device and then a DEXA with a TBS, which is called a trabecular bone score, can give you a little more understanding of what's the total strength of that bone, and particularly the interior and the structure of the bone. Not just does it look dense, but can it actually kind of twist and bend without breaking, which is really important. So I like to kind of explain it as one of two ways. So I can have a cup that's ceramic, or I can have a cup that is porcelain. A ceramic cup is stronger than a porcelain cup. When I put them under a DEXA, they're going to look quite similar, right? Because they're going to x-ray the same, because the exterior has the same sort of look to it. But the ceramic can take a drop better than porcelain. When you put hormones back in the body, you get a ceramic cup. When you add bone restoration drugs or anti-reabsorptive drugs like your Fosamaxes and bisphosphonates, or your anabolic drugs, what you get is a porcelain cup. It looks good on DEXAs, but it may not be high quality, and it really doesn't make the fracture risk that much better, right? So the take-home message is Dr. Wright's research showed that there is a musculoskeletal component to menopause, and that it is absolutely 100% tied to menopause. And that when we do hormone replacement therapy, we actually see an improvement in all of those sort of risk factors. Now, one of the other there's really two studies that came out of this group that I think are really important, is Dr. Lisa Mosconi's group out of the Weill Center at Cornell. And this is a women's dementia and Alzheimer's research center that uses imaging and medicine to assess and treat dementia for women. So Dr. Mosconi's work really looked and emphasized the neuroprotective role of estrogen. And it really suggests that bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, especially if we can initiate it early in that menopause transition or relatively early, can reduce dementia risk. So let's go into what the first study showed. So the first study, it was a systematic review and a meta-analysis of all of the studies leading up to the day they started looking at it. And so basically, they included 6 million women, 6 million records, 6 million studies. And they just wanted to come up with a consensus document to say, what was the dementia risk for women that were on hormone replacement or not? In that study, when they assessed all of the records, that also included the Women's Health Initiative data, right? So it included that data because they were looking at historic data. They found that women that were on bioidentical hormone replacement therapy and or hormone replacement therapy that might have been synthetic showed a decreased risk for dementia and Alzheimer's by 34%. So let that sit with you for a second. If somebody told you that we could give you this one thing and it reduced your risk for Alzheimer's and dementia over your lifetime by 34%, don't you think you would do it? Don't you think you would do it? So essentially, their consensus was hormone replacement therapy protects the brain. And especially if we can start it earlier, we get better protection. And the reason why is estrogen in particular is protective to the blood vessels. and protective to the brain itself. And it actually helps the brain restore volume and keep volume. And when you lose it and you haven't had it for 10 to 15 years, we have some loss that may have occurred during that time period. Not to say that you couldn't restore function, but it's got a little bit of diminishing returns because the brain has aged and also sort of remapped its pathways. So Mosconi's group really came to this answer of hormone replacement therapy is protective against dementia, which I know this is the fear most women have, right? If it's not, anything else, they all say, please don't let me get dementia. That's what I don't want. So it's neuroprotective and reduces risk. Now, Mosconi's group also did a really cool study this year that I think is important because we always believed in the medical community that when you went through menopause, and we had no research to show this. So Mosconi's group actually had to create a tracer to do this. They had to create something just to visualize it. So we always thought that when a woman went through menopause, the receptors, so think of them as the keyhole in the brain for the hormone estrogen to click into and turn on, that when you went through menopause, that those keyholes, those receptors died off. That's what we believed. Did we have research to show that? Hell no. Did we have any way to test that? Hell no. We didn't know. We just made that up, and then we kept propagating it across science. Well, Lisa's group went out and created a tracer. If anybody's had a biopsy and they do that on your breast, they put a little tiny tracer so they can track what's going on. So they had images of women that were, in their 30s, in their 40s, and postmenopausal, the same women. And in some of those women, they did these scans and they were able to pick up the tracer receptor for estrogen. And for the first time ever, they showed that as someone goes through menopause, the number of receptors for estrogen actually rapidly increases in the brain, not decreases. So it's not like they dry up and fall off. They actually make more receptors because estrogen is so important to the brain. Well, Mosconi's group had already shown in previous studies that as we go through menopause, the brain shrinks in volume, so it gets smaller, and it remaps its neural pathways. So think of those as superhighways that head to different parts of the brain. The parts that go to the frontal lobe, the cognitive part, the critical thinking part, those roadways pull away, and then they go back to the creative centers of the brain. So the menopause-related brain fog is totally real, is completely real. And it's because the brain is remodeling itself. And to some degree, they see when somebody's in their 60s and 70s, it seems like that remodeling process is done, and much of what was seen kind of changes, but the brain is mapped differently now, right? So when they did this study and they found that the receptors increased, that has now changed our entire medical paradigm to help us understand that estrogen is actually vital to these cells in the body. And in many cases, particularly in the brain, when we start to lose those estrogen levels, your body produces a ton more receptors to get what little is circulating. So we could extrapolate. Now, we don't know this. I'm making an educated guess. Our liver does that. Our heart does that. Our blood vessels do that. Our other organs do that because every single tissue in our body has receptors for estrogen, except for your red blood cells and a single type of brain cell in the brain. Everything else has receptors for it. So Mosconi's research now has put us on a new trajectory to really start doing some deep dive in understanding the receptor activity for estrogen and what may be at play, maybe even in other disease states. So that is huge. So all of that is really, to me, so fascinating. One last study I want to sort of back up on is a few other ones that were done previously, but I want to talk about it. There's another study that came out looking at menopause, the benefits of postmenopausal symptoms and what they call comorbid conditions. This is one done by Candarelli and team in 2007. And what they found, so just to kind of add to this is obviously not a year in review, but I'm adding to the rest of the year in review. This group looked at hormone replacement therapy and the benefits, and they found that it's effective in managing hot flashes, night sweats, vaginal dryness. It was effective at preventing osteoporosis, bone loss, fracture risks, potentially improving type 2 diabetes. So estrogen helps us transport glucose, it helps us be insulin sensitive, and it helps keep you from putting on visceral fat around the middle. If all of those things aren't being protected, you have a greater risk for metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes. So insulin or estrogen is protective because it has this positive effect on that entire system. they also showed that it reduced colorectal cancer risk. Colon cancer is a serious risk. It's one of the most deadly cancers for people who don't get screened frequently, or at least at the right intervals. Again, sort of recommend that we make hormone replacement therapy be bioidentical, and it's particularly beneficial when it's been personalized to the woman. Another group, Morin and colleagues back in 98, showed cardiovascular protection. They actually showed a 50% reduced risk of coronary artery disease, improved cholesterol levels, because we know estrogen replacement therapy lowers cholesterol, lowering homocysteine, which is an inflammatory amino acid that can cause cardiovascular damage, and other cardiovascular markers. It also showed improvement in blood pressure and obviously bone health along with it. And they also showed some immune enhancements. So this was another group. This is Porter and colleagues in 2001, showed increased B cell counts and T cell count activation. And so the immune system is now amplified, able to fight infections and other things. And obviously the cognitive and memory enhancement is very obvious. They showed hormone replacement therapy had better learning and verbal memory activities. So if we take this and we look at all of the information, right? All of the information, particularly the big studies that came out this last year, here's my consensus of the whole thing. The Women's Health Initiative was crap. It still is crap. Reissuing of it this year at least has improved the argument. But the problem is the admission of we were wrong. We inappropriately caused fear and damage to, an entire generation of women. And we just came in with our bias is never going to be said. It's never going to be said. They are holding to their guns. And at least now the study that was issued this year with their validation of the statistical analysis is the right one. So if you go back to read it, do not read the earlier versions because it's absolutely inaccurate. And again, look at the data, just don't look at their discussion and their conclusions because they're still trying to save face. Instead of having the research integrity say we were wrong, it's a whole lot easier to say we were wrong. If you've listened to my podcast, I admit I'm wrong all the time. I'm like, hey, I used to tell you to eat small amounts of protein all day. I don't do that anymore. Hey, guess what? I used to not think that cholesterol was a problem. Now I do, based on new research coming out of Tom Dayspring's arena. So researchers, if they have integrity, admit when they're wrong. And I'm sorry, if I meet them, I will tell them I think that they lack integrity. So the Women's Health Initiative, look at the 2024 version if you're looking at it. The 10 million women study shows that hormone replacement therapy is protective in all-cause mortality, particularly estrogen itself. But if you have a uterus, you need progesterone to protect the uterine lining because estrogen's job is to bring blood supply to the uterine lining, so you need to manage that. Progesterone has its whole other supportive structure, like improving GABA, which is anti-anxiety, helping with sleep. Progesterone to me is really important. Testosterone I would throw into that mix. It wasn't part of the conversation today because we don't have as many studies on women, although it helps with sexual dysfunction, brain, mood, and also bone and muscle. The other thing is we also have other symptoms to menopause that are not just hot flashes, night sweats, and vaginal dryness. It can be heart palpitations, cardiovascular memory issues, insomnia, mood, anxiety, depression, joint pain, frozen shoulder, GERD-like symptoms, fatigue. All of those are also concerning. And we now have good data coming out of Dr. Wright's office that shows us that menopause is absolutely a driver of joint pain and other musculoskeletal concerns. And then at the very minimum, we've got Mosconi's group that has done the world a massive amount of favor in showing what's different about a woman's brain compared to a man's brain. Because again, until her group, most people looked at a man's brain and just assumed we were the same. And I can tell you, they don't look any bit alike. Not electrically, not cognitively, not anything. And so they have the best repository of women's health data around brain imaging. And they showed that hormone replacement therapy is protective against dementia by 34%, regardless of the administration. And that when we go through menopause, the body is actually trying very desperately to capture estrogen. And that it really is the opposite. The body is trying to make more receptors for it, not less. So how do you take this home? What's your take-home message? If you've been on the fence about hormone replacement therapy, I'm not saying every woman needs to be on hormone replacement therapy because I have some women that, after they've tried it or, whatever, it just didn't seem to be for them. I'm like, cool, it's not. Let's make sure you're as healthy as possible. Let's optimize everything else. And we don't have to do hormones. but I damn well think you deserve the right to talk about it with somebody who's going to treat you with respect and listen to your concerns and have knowledge of the research and be able to talk intelligently about it and help you be informed. I also believe that you have the right to ask for lab testing and other testing to see what your levels are before you start and to see what your levels are while you're on it and how you metabolize it, because that way you know you also have therapeutic levels. I'll give you a little real quick story as to why I'm so adamant about this. I had a woman that I saw a couple weeks ago who was 63 years old, had been on bioidentical hormone replacement therapy by a well-meaning practitioner, had a DEXA scan, about 5 years ago, really showed okay bone structure, right? And she had another one just recently, and she had lost significant amount of bone. She was osteoporosis, right? So the stats are for a woman who falls after 50, and especially after 65, 50% of women will never regain their previous function, right? It's the leading cause of accidental death in the United States. Osteoporotic fractures are serious, and they often are what lead women to nursing homes and assisted living centers. So this woman was obviously distraught because she's like, I've been on hormones. What the hell? What was going on? She was also eating appropriately, plenty of protein, lifting weights. She was doing the right stuff. When we checked her hormone levels, our nurse practitioner checked them, her estrogen levels were inadequate, completely inadequate. They were not therapeutic to actually improve the brain, the heart, the bones. Because she was told if she didn't have hot flashes and her vagina was not like a Sahara desert, she was fine, right? No, she wasn't fine. One of the greatest risk factors for frailty and nursing home visits, osteoporosis, was not being protected. So if you're going on symptoms alone, that's inadequate to know if you're sufficient. And I never had a hot flash. I had a shit ton of other symptoms, but I didn't have that. So we can't go on something so inaccurate and so circumstantial to the person. We need science and data. I think you deserve the labs. And if you have people that won't work with you like that, you need to kick them to the curb, because medicine is a customer service industry and you deserve a practitioner that listens to you, because at the end of the day, it's your body, not theirs. They're not your gatekeeper. They're your partner. And so I want you to really take an opportunity to look at these studies. What I'm going to do in the show notes is I'm actually going to include just these very simple studies. So you can go out and look at them. You can go out and look at them and read them yourself. You can take them to your practitioner. And again, if they don't listen to you, my team will. And so I hope you found this to be helpful. I hope it maybe helped you understand what the current research really shows. And if you were fearful, maybe this answered some of your questions. And if you still have questions, read the studies that I'm going to include in the show notes. And then I will be back with you next week on Menopause Mastery. And I hope you have a healthy and happy day. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Menopause Mastery podcast. You are why I'm here, and I am so very grateful. Hit subscribe so you don't miss any wisdom on creating the most exceptional life on our terms. If this episode has helped you in any way, please share it with a friend to spread the love, and together we rise. You can follow me on social media at Betty Murray, PhD, and you can reach me online at bettymurray.com.